Continuing on our seawater properties lecture, we'll be looking now starting at temperature and some of the other features. Here we go. Move me out of the way. And there we go. Ocean temperature, no surprise, depends quite a bit on where you are on the globe, north-south. And in turn, this goes back to the fact that the amount of sunlight energy that you get varies from where you are pole to equator. However, we do have ocean currents, and these ocean currents can carry warmer water away from the equator or cooler water towards the equator, causing some exceptions to where it's warmer or colder to what you might expect. For example, Mark Twain once claimed that the coldest winter he ever encountered was a summer in San Francisco. Now, not surprisingly with Twain, that is an exaggeration. He had encountered much colder winters, but if you're expecting warm temperature and instead you find cool temperatures, as you would in summer in San Francisco, it may feel rather chilly. This is because we have a cold current that comes down from Alaska along the west coast. And so right along the coast of California stays fairly cool year-round, while not too far away, inland, it may be quite hot. Another example, we also have cool currents coming north along the west coast of South America. And this is part of why there are penguins in the Galapagos Islands right near the equator. Here are diagrams. The left-hand one shows August, the right-hand February. With the seasons, we do have some back and forth moving of the temperature patterns. Not surprisingly, it's warmer in the northern hemisphere during our summer and warmer towards the south during their summer. So shifts back and forth there, but basic idea, yep, we're seeing concentration of the warmest temperatures towards the equator, cooler as we get further, but we do see things like the Gulf Stream coming along here and bringing warm water further north, or the cool California current bringing the colder water south here. Zooming in, this is the August view. You can see the details a little bit better. And also here's an animation of sea surface temperatures, if things show up here. There we go. So this is showing changing month to month. You can see the shifts north and south. There's also year-to-year variation in how strong or weak particular cool or warm currents are. So you see some of that variation. There's a lot more detail on the website if you want to investigate this further yourself. Okay. That was surface temperature. What happens if we look further down? Well, it turns out that warm water is right near the surface. As you go deeper, we reach the point where it's all cold in the deep ocean. Of course, near the poles, it's also cold up towards the surface as well. And so this zone of relatively rapid change in temperature is known as a thermocline. Therm, like thermometer, of course, refers to the temperature. Cline is our zone of change. This depends on where you are. In temperate regions, such as along the coast here, the pattern of the thermocline is much more seasonal. Now, if you've been to the beach at different times, you've noticed, or that might just be in Boiling Springs, you've noticed that the temperature changes. It's warmer sometimes of the year, colder at others, and water has a high capacity. It's slower, but the water temperature pattern changes as well. So during winter, there would be much less of a thermocline. During the summer, it could be relatively well developed. Of course, in polar areas, it's cold all the time. So the surface water never particularly gets warm, and the water is cold basically top to bottom. So here's a diagram of that, showing an area with strong seasons. By March, it's about all the same temperature top to bottom. As we move into the summer, we get increasing development of a thermocline. And then from the summer into the fall, going back away to much less of a thermocline. Okay, so, well, this matters what temperature it is in the water. And of course, things living in the water care what temperature it is. But also this has some important additional effects. What's this going to do for mixing? If things work well in the first lab, you may see being able to make layers of warmer, less dense water over colder, denser water. The two don't mix easily. So this means that when we do have a thermocline well developed in the summer, that warm surface water isn't particularly mixing with the deeper, cooler water. So we'll have separate zones there. Up at the surface, that's where we've got almost all the sunshine. So we've got algae floating around, things eating the algae, so forth. As those dyes sink down, the nutrients are accumulating deeper down. So by later in the summer, a lot of the nutrients have been used up. As we get to less of a thermocline in the winter, now not much difference between the shallow and deeper, and the layers can mix. So we bring the nutrients that sank down back up into the surface. And so there's often a bloom of plankton associated with this mixing with all the dose of nutrients. So we can get this both in the fall and in the spring, where there's more mixing. If we have a permanent thermocline, then things stay not mixed. The bottom part, not touching the surface, is going to end up being low in oxygen. And so remains from dead things, stuff like that can build up. I was at a meeting where someone was talking about trying to drill down in such a place because there's no oxygen. You basically don't have animals. And with no animals, the mud doesn't get stirred around. So you get very nice layers that record what sank down in your water body. In this case, it was a lake. So it's a very good record if you're trying to study, say, pattern of climate change over the past few centuries to thousands of years or so. Drilling down in a place like this gives you a rather nice sample. This particular lake was in New York, so what they did was just wait till winter, and then they can just haul their drilling rig out onto the ice, cut a hole in the ice, and lower things to start drilling. So their drill is cutting a hole into the bottom of the lake, getting a sample of the layers down there. And that hole also provides an escape route for gases that were trapped in there from decay. So as they're drilling, all of a sudden they notice that the ice is kind of wiggling. So they quickly head for shore, and their hole in the ice becomes a fountain as all the trapped gases mix in and the layers were mixed, something that had not happened for centuries. You may have encountered thermocline. The main one in the ocean is somewhat deep down, but jumping into a larger body of water, you might go to the side being careful first and stick your toe in. Surface feels warm, you jump in, and at the bottom of the dive it feels kind of colder down there. That's a thermocline. Deeper lakes often have this as well. This can be a bit of a problem, letting water out the dam at the other end. Often that's tapping from the bottom, letting that extra cold water out, which may not be what would be the natural flow. For example, talking with some folks who had done a survey looking for rare clams and snails in a river in North Alabama in the summer. The air temperature was around 90 degrees. So being in the water felt good. And then the big dam upstream started releasing cold water from the bottom of the lake. And pretty soon everybody was getting out of the water and getting wetsuits on over swimsuit because that was cold. And those temperature changes are probably not the greatest thing for the stuff living in the river. What about salinity? How does that vary place to place? Well, not too surprisingly, where do we have more rain? Oh, that's more water, tends to be fresher. Areas with less rain tend to have some more evaporation and saltier. And of course, hotter places have more evaporation. So somewhat towards the equator tends to be more salty. Here's our temperature map again, but not right at the equator as it turns out. Why would we not see as much right at the equator? Well, think about what's on land. At the equator, say here in Brazil or Central Africa or Indonesia, we have tropical rainforests. As we'll look at much more in meteorology, air conditions towards the equator promote having a lot of rain, and so that tends to counteract the effect of evaporation. As we move a little further out from the equator, then we get into, like with the Sahara here, a much less rainy zone, and correspondingly, those tend to be the areas with the highest salinity. As we move further out, the cooler temperatures mean there's less evaporation. And so once again, oceans tend to be somewhat less salty as we get closer to the poles. And there are plenty of local factors as well. Do we have a big river? You can actually be out of sight of land off the Amazon and still have fresh water under you because there's so much coming out there. So here's a map showing the levels of salinity. I've put a couple of numbers bigger to make them a little easier to read. Again, we see higher salinities a little bit to either side of the equator, relatively low salinities in more polar areas. Can you guess what part of the ocean, relatively large, big enough to be visible on here, but connected to the actual main ocean, would be the highest salinity? Well, high salinity, and you want to be away from any major river mouths. You'd want to be kind of in these little ways away from the equator areas, north or south. A somewhat enclosed area gives less opportunity for mixing, more opportunity to build up conditions, whether it's fresher, like in the relatively enclosed Arctic, or somewhat saltier. And those factors all come together with the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. It's a desert. Now, particularly, there's no significant river going into the Red Sea. We do have Tigris and Euphrates that help freshen things a little bit for the Persian Gulf. Very sunny and dry, not much precipitation at all, plenty of evaporation, and they are somewhat cut off in the main ocean. So the Red Sea actually is typically around 40 parts per thousand. Now, of course, enclosed salt lakes like the Dead Sea, those can get much saltier. But for the actual ocean, the Red Sea is the highest. So here's a diagram version of that. The purple line here is variation in how salty it is going from north to south. The dashed kind of blue-greenish line here is the variation in the relative amounts of evaporation and precipitation. So again, right near the equator, yeah, there's plenty of evaporation, but there's lots of precipitation. As we move a little out to either side, we get into zones where we see more evaporation than anywhere closer to the poles, but not so much precipitation. And again, as we get more towards the poles from there, we're seeing less evaporation. And there are ups and downs of precipitation as well. As with temperature, difference in salinity in different layers in the ocean can produce distinct layers. These are known as haloclines. Halo meaning salt. Halite, for example, is the mineral name for standard table salt. Halogen is the name for the group of elements: fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. These readily form salts by reacting with metals. So halocline, salt. The biggest haloclines are where we have fresh water coming into contact with salt water, say where a river is flowing into the ocean. But we have somewhat more subtle haloclines happening out in the ocean, where you have zones where it's a little bit more or a little bit less salty. Of course, if we have a matching temperature change at the same level, then that would contribute even more strongly to the layering. For the ocean as a whole, we see the strongest layering in the mid parts, between about 40 degrees north, 40 degrees south. 40 degrees north is kind of north of the middle of the US. Density in seawater, that will relate to temperature. We've already noted that as things get warmer, the atoms are wiggling around more, so they tend to be spread out more, and so things get less dense as they get warmer. Also important in meteorology, hot air balloons do go up. Salinity. As we noted, salt is denser than water, so salt water is going to be denser than fresh water. Pressure. The more pressure we put on water, water doesn't squeeze very much, not nearly as much as air does, but it can compress somewhat. And so the more pressure we have, water is going to be getting somewhat denser as well. More pressure, well, the deeper you are, the more the pressure is. That's automatic. You've got more water on top of you pressing down, the deeper you go. So pressure goes up with depth. Nothing is going to make that change very much. You aren't going to get any particular layerings. It's just lots of pressure further down, less near the surface. Temperature, salinity, as we've been seeing, those change around rather more. It's not necessarily going to be a constant pattern. And so temperature and salinity can, again, set up different layers in the ocean. Even though saltier water is denser than fresher water at the same temperature, potentially we could have warm, salty water that is less dense than cold, fresher water. Or conversely, very salty, warm water could be denser than cold, fresh water. So it's going to be complicated. What's our exact balance of temperature and salinity to give us layering? Whatever type of layering we have due to different densities, our zone of transition is going to be known as a pycnocline. This could be a thermocline, it could be a halocline, it could be both together. But either way, it's going to be a zone of distinct changes in density. And so the pycnocline is our kind of general term that will include both haloclines and thermoclines. Diagram version of that. If our temperature is doing this, here's a zone of major change, so it's a thermocline. Our salinity does that. We have two zones of major change, so two haloclines, and these will also be pycnoclines. In this particular example, temperature is going down and salinity is going up together, so they add up to a quite strong pycnocline. And then down here, it's only the salinity, nothing much is going on in temperature, so we have a smaller pycnocline there. For the ocean in general, we can recognize three major zones related to this: a surface layer, and then a pycnocline zone under that, and then finally the deep ocean beneath that. As we'll see later, we can also recognize some layers within the deep ocean. The surface layer is relatively thin, only about 100 meters. Correspondingly, that only takes up about 2% of the total volume of the oceans. At the surface, it's encountering air, and air has all sorts of weather going on in it. Just to glance out the window will show that it's true. So not surprisingly, surface layer things tend to be variable. It can get warmer, cooler, saltier, fresher, lots of things are going on there. But overall, the surface layer at the surface tends to be somewhat warmer. Also, in some areas, it is fresher. So we have difference in our density for the surface layer versus the pycnocline underneath it, and then the deep at the bottom. Our pycnocline zone, in some ways it's a transition, makes up not quite 20% of the ocean. Closest to the equator, no surprise, the surface is warm, and so the pycnocline is dominantly a thermocline. More towards the mid-latitudes, we're getting into zones where salinity is not quite so high, and so salinity is the big player in causing a difference in density, the pycnocline. So it's more halocline dominating to give that density difference towards the mid-latitudes They kind of like around here, we're roughly about that far north. Deep layer, of course, that's the rest of our ocean, 80%. Water in the deep layer sinks down from near the poles. It gets very cold. No surprise, water near Antarctica being cold. Being cold, dense, it'll sink down and then flow under the other water, and that cold, dense water can flow towards the equator away from the poles. A little more detail on gases. We noted that gases dissolve in seawater, present there. What affects the amounts? Turns out gas dissolves in water better the colder it is. You're probably aware that when a carbonated drink gets warm, it tends to go flat faster. This is true of all gases dissolving in water. See that in the graph here. Salt water. Gases dissolve less well than in pure water. Again, kind of the salt getting in the way there. More pressure promotes the gas going into the water dissolving. You can sort of think of the pressure as helping push the gas in. Lower pressure and the gas can escape. Noted how that can be a problem with scuba diving with the bins. And again, it's what you see happening when you take the lid off of your soda. The bubbles escaping there are because gas was added under pressure, and then now that you open it up, release the pressure, the bubbles can escape some. Okay, why does this matter? Again, two of the major gases in water, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are important for living things. And so different amounts of those can be quite significant. For example, fishing. Trout are fairly active fish. They only live in water that has a lot of oxygen available. Anyone who is into fishing would recognize that this fella is probably fishing for trout. In fact, that's probably the only type of big fish you'd get in a place like that. Up in a fast-flowing mountain stream, water is relatively cool, more oxygen dissolving there. Fast-flowing, so it's carrying the air, mixing around. Again, good for plenty of oxygen. Tarpon are a popular game fish, not as much for eating, but if you catch one on your hook, the tarpon gets quite excited and swims fast and jumps around and all that. So it's exciting to catch, and they're pretty big too, so that contributes to the excitement there. So there's popularity in trying fishing for tarpon, but tarpon do not live in mountain streams. They live in warm ocean areas, like around southern Florida, Caribbean. Those would be places you might go to if you were trying to fish for tarpon. Warmer water, that's less oxygen. Salt water, that's less oxygen. Tarpon actually will get into kind of still water areas near the coast, not much mixing around. Relatively low oxygen settings. How do they get all that oxygen? It helps them be more energetic in their activity. Turns out, well, there's a pretty good source of oxygen not too far from the water. Air. Tarpon actually breathe air. If you keep a tarpon underwater, it will drown. Not what you expect of a fish, but They do depend on gulping air and getting extra oxygen that way. Actually, a fair number of fish have some ability to get oxygen there. There are not many are as dependent on it as the tarpon are. Top of the water, it's contacting the air, and so as much gas as can dissolve is going to be dissolved. So you're going to have the water there saturated with gases. That surface water mixes around, sinks down, carries gases with it. Again, nitrogen, the noble gases, those are pretty unreactive. So basically just stay saturated wherever you are. But our oxygen or carbon dioxide, those can change due to other things going on under the ocean. Big player, living things, respiration. What are you wanting to get when you breathe in? What are you getting rid of to breathe out? The more ocean creatures are breathing in, the more oxygen is being used up, and the more waste carbon dioxide is being released. So lots of living things can be decreasing the oxygen supply. On the other hand, if we're in a shallow enough part of the ocean to have enough light, we can have photosynthesis. And so algae, we have a few types of plants that can manage in shallow parts of the ocean as well. Those are using up carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. And so if you have enough of those around, then that will counteract the oxygen being used up by breathing of things. This is why it's a good idea to have some plants in your fish aquarium as well. Decay. That tends to use up oxygen and release carbon dioxide, like respiration does. And if we have any volcanism down in the bottom of the ocean, well, carbon dioxide is a major gas produced by volcanoes. Oxygen is not. So volcanoes can put some carbon dioxide in, affect the amounts that way as well. Diagram version, same sort of thing. Again, up at the top, we have mixing with air, splashing of waves, of bubbles, things like that. Living things, they're breathing. We have decay, we have photosynthesis. Once we're down to the picnic line, it's mostly dark enough that we don't really have much photosynthesis left. And advection, that's just the sinking of water from the surface, bringing the gases with it. All this means that for oxygen, we have a fair amount up near the surface, reasonable amount in most deep ocean areas, and a minimum zone corresponding to the picnic line. Surface, well, there's lots of oxygen air, a lot more in the air than will saturate water. So surface water can get all the oxygen that it can. The deep water, again, we've got cold oxygen-rich water sinking down from the surface, contributing to the deep. Why is there a minimum in the picnic line? Well, as stuff sinks down from shallower areas, that change in density means that stuff will slow down as it sinks. And so there's a high concentration of pieces of things that sink down, living things feeding on that. In feeding, they're also respiring, using up oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. Stuff that doesn't get eaten may decay and contribute as well. But again, picnic line, it's a zone. It's got greater density than the stuff on top, less dense than the stuff underneath, so it doesn't mix well. The higher oxygen water at the surface can't mix easily into the picnic line. The higher oxygen deep water can't mix in very well. All this means that we didn't have lower oxygen in the picnic line. No surprise, this affects what can live there. We also often have low oxygen zones associated with human activity. If we dump a lot of nutrients into water, say going into rivers, those nutrients might be, say, sewage or fertilizers washing off of fields. All that extra nutrient going in the river, coming out into the ocean, tends to make certain types of algae really take off. Lots and lots of the algae. That algae dies, decays. The decay uses up oxygen, and we get zones of low oxygen referred to as dead zones due to the pollution. So this is prominent, say, near the mouth of the Mississippi River, various other river mouth areas. Deep ocean, again, we have cold, relatively oxygen-rich water from the surface near the poles sinking down to form our deep layer. Down the deep ocean, there's not too much food. Living things are pretty spread out typically, and so oxygen is not being used up very fast. But if we have an area in the deep ocean that does not have good connections out to the poles where we have that sinking cold water, then deep water may be trapped there, and over time, decay and the like can lead to low to no oxygen conditions. In these situations, almost all animals depend on oxygen like we do. And so you have few to no animals, only very specialized ones able to tolerate those conditions will be living in these anoxic patches, or even the dysoxic ones. Here's a diagram showing, again, we have cold, oxygen-rich surface water sinking down near Antarctica up towards the North Polar regions and traveling under the other parts of the ocean, mixing oxygen into the deep ocean. Surface layer, of course, it touches the air, so it gets plenty of oxygen that way. Picnic line's kind of stuck, not much area able to get new oxygen in. Our other significantly variable gas is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide not only interacts with living things, it also interacts with pH, how acidic or basic things are, so it's even more complicated. Carbon dioxide from the air is one source. Quite a lot of the extra carbon dioxide that humans have been producing by burning stuff has gone into the ocean and affected it. Of course, respiration, breathing out, we're getting rid of carbon dioxide. And again, decay helps release carbon dioxide as well. Carbon dioxide gets used up by photosynthesis, and also dissolved carbon dioxide can be used up by building shells or other carbonate minerals. So here's carbon dioxide dissolving in water, getting used by photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide in water, reacting, getting used up to make carbonate skeletons like shells, corals, things like that. Again, carbon dioxide plus water makes relatively weak acid, but still somewhat acid. That can cause some problems. Less carbon dioxide is more basic, or conversely, if you do something to make things chemically more basic, that will use up carbon dioxide, make there be less of it. So the two can interact, either one could push the other. When conditions are more acidic, that makes it harder to build skeletons of carbonate, which again, that's not good news for corals, for the shells, things like sand dollars, starfish. There are a lot of algae that make carbonate skeletons. A lot of things are going to be affected by that. Now, of course, different types have different tolerances, but it's going to be a general problem. Another issue, even if pH isn't to the point of making it hard to build skeletons or killing you if pH is too extreme, still changes in pH can have impacts on behavior. Too extreme will be toxic to living things. For example, there was one study reporting, although another wasn't finding the same effect, so there's still some work needing to be done to figure out the details. But this one study reported that fish, although they seemed healthy, they were less responsive to the smell of a predator when pH got more acidic. If you just sit there as the predator comes along, no, that's not good for your health. Another example, a study on crabs found that mother crabs, which carry eggs around incubation characteristically, they receive a chemical produced by the eggs that tells them, you've got eggs, take care of them. As pH got more acidic, the female crab evidently was unable to still smell that chemical, and so didn't realize that you needed to be trying to take care of those eggs being carried around, and so not waving water past them to help keep them well oxygenated and keep them clean, stuff like that. Obviously not good news for the crab eggs, and that's not good news long term for the crab population. Changing pH, interaction with carbon dioxide, turns out that overall we have more carbon dioxide in deep ocean, where it's deep enough it can be acidic to the point of tending to dissolve carbonates, bits and pieces of shells and other things down on the sea floor. The water is cold, promoting holding more gas. It's under lots of pressure in the deep ocean as well. So much carbon dioxide is able to dissolve there, more acidic, and carbonate sediment will tend to dissolve when you're deep enough in the deep ocean. Shallow ocean, especially warm areas, we do not see that. Less pressure, so less gas. Warm, less gas. Shallow, we can have light, so there's photosynthesis using up the carbon dioxide. All these mean that the water is notably less acidic, and in fact, instead of being dissolved, may actually from time to time get carbonate being precipitated directly out of the water because there's so much there and not the carbon dioxide form. Okay, that's a good spot to pause here. So